Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So just one announcement before we get started today. You probably know you have another problem set due on Tuesday, next Tuesday, and I will post that problem set tomorrow morning to give you plenty of time to work on it. So it will be even more fun than the last one you did. It really will be. Okay, so so far we've really looked at three sort of different models of international trade. So you recall we started with the Ricardian model of trade, and at least in the classical assumption, we made, or the classical model, we made the assumption that we had constant labor productivity. And we saw some nice results out of that. We then sort of said, okay, let's think about models that have more than one factor of production. So we introduced a second factor, capital, although it could have been something else, in the context of our Heckscher-Ohlin model. Now, the Heckscher-Ohlin model had these two factors of production. It did not require that labor have constant marginal product. And so we were, in some sense, generalizing the Ricardian model a bit. And then last week, we moved to the specific factors model, which expanded the number of factors of production to 3, but also imposed some restrictions that some of the factors of production could not move freely and costlessly, at least not in the short run, to other industries. And so we saw then that there was, yet again, an allocation of income that was based on whether a factor was mobile between industries or whether or not it was specific to either the export industry or the import competing industries. I went to the orthodontist today, they tightened them up, so I can't, that's hard for me to talk today. Whether they're in the import competing industry or the export industry. So it may seem as if each of these are sort of three very separate, distinct types of models, and that we would use a model or decide which of these models to use depending upon the circumstances that we were looking at. It actually turns out that all three of these models are simply special cases of a much more general model that we call the standard trade model. So today and Thursday, we want to look at the standard trade model and look at some applications of that standard trade model. And then what we can see is, hopefully we will be able to see, is with a few assumptions how easily the Ricardian model falls out of it, with a few other assumptions how the Heckscher-Ohlin model or the specific factors model falls out of it. So again, we've gone from the very specific to the more general, and so it's that more general item that we want to look at today and next time. So let's think about the assumptions that we have over and above what we've talked about, or the assumptions at least that we're changing. So here we allow the economy to have many factors of production. Not one, not two, not three, but as many as you want to think about in terms of the production functions that the economy is dealing with. We're going to continue, however, to assume that each one of the factors, the supply of the factor, is fixed for the time being, and that it's also fully utilized. That's not to say that economies can't operate inside their production possibilities frontier, but when they do, that is a problem for macroeconomics. So if you haven't had 100B with me, come next semester, and we'll talk about the macroeconomics of it. And if you have had 100B with me or anyone else, you already know the answer to get the economy to its production possibilities frontier. So we just want to analyze the situation. What if we have all our factors of production fully employed? And then the other assumption that we will make is that all factors of production have diminishing marginal products, something that's very observable in the real world. So we've got as many factors of production as you would like, all of which their supplies are fixed and fully utilized, all of which have diminishing marginal products. So a very generalized production function would look something like this, where the output, the quantity produced in industry sub I, would be the level of technology that's in that industry, and then some function of all the various and sundry factors of production that are relative to that particular industry. Now remember, one of the things that we showed in the specific factors model is we can have different combinations of factors of production for different industries. So you remember last week we talked about autos, capital and labor. We didn't really talk about land. But for food, we had land and workers, labor, so we didn't talk much about capital. So it doesn't need to be the same list or the same importance for each of the factors of production as we think about different industries. And again, mathematically, this is just a notation to suggest that we have diminishing marginal products for each of our factors of production. So if we were to think about a production function where we put the output of some product on the vertical axis and labor on the horizontal axis, since we know we have diminishing product of labor, we know our production function will look something like that. So our output of cloth would be the technology in the cloth industry times some function of the labor in cloth, the capital that we use in the cloth industry, the land that we use in the cloth industry, and any other factors of production. Right? So that's a very standard type production function with diminishing returns, in this case diminishing returns to labor. Now, one of the things we want to ask ourselves, what would happen here if the amount of capital in this industry were to rise? What happens if our capital stock increases? Now, in fact, I'm just picking the capital stock as a non-labor factor of production. This could be any of the other factors of production. So what will happen here? Okay, the production function is going to rotate higher, right? If each worker has more capital to work with, or more land to work with, or more of any of the other important factors of production to work with, they should be able to produce more output. So in this case, if any of the factors of production other than labor were to increase, then the production function itself will rotate higher. Okay. Now remember that the slope of the production function tells us the marginal product of labor. Now this, of course, is just a production function for one good, cloth, and normally when we talk about production possibility frontiers, we have two goods. So here's our quantity of cloth, here's our quantity of wine. Yes, we're going back to Portugal and England, because everybody should have an adult beverage in their examples. So we need a production possibilities frontier. So the production possibilities frontier is going to have this shape that's concave to the origin, and the slope of this will be the ratio of the marginal product of labor in wine divided by the marginal product of labor in cloth. Now notice, that's no different than anything that we've had before, right? This is when we kind of had the modern Ricardian theory. One of the things we talked about was we allowed the marginal product of labor now to change depending on how much labor we had, and we ended up with a production possibilities frontier that looked very much like this one. And that was the kind of production possibilities frontier that we continue to use when we talk about the Heckscher-Ohlin model or even with the specific factors model. It's just that this is much, much more general than the production possibilities frontier with the modern Ricardian model. So we've got something much more general because we've got all these other resources that we can look at here besides just labor. Okay, so now we've got a production possibilities frontier. We need to, at this point, however, introduce a new concept or new term that we probably haven't talked about. I may have mentioned this just in passing, but and that is terms of trade. Terms of trade. So the terms of trade is simply the price of the good a country initially exports divided by the price of the good that a country initially imports. Now, if you remember back to our Ricardian example where we had Portugal and England, England had a comparative advantage in wine, and Portugal had a comparative advantage in cloth, right? So Portugal if Portugal has a comparative advantage in cloth, then once international trade is opened up, what will Portugal export? Cloth, right? You export those goods in which you have a comparative advantage. So Portugal also exports cloth. Therefore, Portugal's terms of trade is the relative price of cloth. The price of the good that it initially exports divided by the price of the good that it initially imports. Now notice when we say that, we only can talk about the terms of trade if international trade is actually taking place. So terms of trade is not a concept that we use when we talk about going from autarky to international trade. We know that the relative prices will change when that happens. But to talk about the terms of trade, trade actually has to exist. Yes? So, no, the terms of trade will be whatever this is. Yes, so that'll be the world equilibrium price, but it can change, as we'll see in a minute. At the beginning of the situation, okay? So one of the things that we'll see is most of the examples that we've used so far, we've said, suppose we're in autarky. Now let's open up to free international trade. Well, most countries aren't in autarky, right? For most countries, some international trade is already taking place. So one of the things that we want to be able to think about then is, suppose international trade is taking place. Now something happens that causes the relative price of cloth to change. Well, what can we say? Well, if the relative price of cloth rises, then I also know that the terms of trade for Portugal have increased because I already know that Portugal is exporting cloth. So that's our initial condition when we talk about initially exporting. So it's just where we begin. Okay, so we're only talking about one good, or we can talk about, in the case of multiple goods, we can talk about whether we're net importers or exporters. So we can always talk about baskets of goods. Right? Okay, now this is for Portugal. Now obviously in our example, England had a comparative advantage in wine. Therefore England was initially exporting wine once we opened it to international trade. And therefore England's terms of trade are the relative price of wine. PW divided by PC. Obviously just the inverse of what we have here. Now, as we can figure out from this, when the relative price of cloth rises, we call that an increase in the terms of trade. So that would be for Portugal. For the country that is importing cloth, exporting wine, it's a decrease in its terms of trade. Okay, so what's happening to relative prices also tells us what's happening to the terms of trade. Now here's what's interesting. If you know what the terms of trade are, if you know what's happened to the terms of trade, increases or decreases, you can also determine what's happened to aggregate economic welfare. Knowing what happens to the terms of trade also tells us what happens to aggregate economic welfare. So a rise in the terms of trade increases economic welfare, where a decline decreases economic welfare. So let me just demonstrate that real quickly. So here we have Portugal's free trade situation. So notice what we have. We've set this up so that the production possibilities frontier is biased towards cloth, telling us that Portugal has comparative advantage in cloth. Point A is our autarky position, where it's just tangent to our autarky iso-value budget line, which has the slope of whatever our internal prices are. We produce and consume. No, that's not right, is it? No, this is a trade situation, not an autarky situation. Tighten it way too tight. Okay, so back up here. So this is let's go back a slide, then we'll come back. Okay, get my head around this yet. Okay, so starting again. Sometimes it's just easier to rewind. Okay, so here we've got Portugal's free trade situation. Okay? Production possibilities frontier biased towards cloth. Here we have the iso-value budget line in trade. So the relative price here that we're looking at is the world relative price of cloth. And what this shows us is that we want to produce at point A, which will give us S sub C quantity of cloth and S sub W quantity of wine. That's where Portugal produces, but where they consume will, again, be somewhere along the budget line, but where the budget line is tangent to its highest country indifference curve, way up here at CIC1. So we'll be consuming at point B with quantity of cloth D sub C and quantity of wine D sub W. So this gives us our consumption and our productions. Notice, of course, that we're producing more cloth than we're consuming, so we're exporting the difference. We're consuming more wine than we're producing, so we're importing wine. So that's just our initial free trade situation. Now let's assume, for maybe reasons we don't understand yet, that the relative price of cloth increases. Okay? So remember, this is also telling us that the terms of trade for Portugal have increased. So what happens? How do we show that here? Right. So if our relative price of cloth increases, it means the slope of the ISO value budget line has now become steeper. So we're now sitting here with a new relative price of cloth, which is higher. So we've got a steeper ISO value line. Our production point will be where that ISO value line is just tangent to the production possibilities frontier. So notice we increase the quantity of cloth that we're producing, and we decrease the quantity of wine that we're producing. Okay. And again, in thinking about it, if prices are going up, obviously we would like to produce more of that good. And in order to do so, we need to steal resources away from the other production of the other product. So that's where we're producing now. Now we need to figure out where we're consuming. Well, we know we're going to consume along this new budget line. The ISO value and the budget line lie on top of each other. So we produce here. This tells us how much income we have, but we can actually buy along this curve or line. So we're going to end up finding the highest country indifference curve that is just tangent to the budget line. And so we will be consuming at point D, where the demand for cloth has gone down a little and the demand for wine has gone up. And notice, of course, that we're on a higher country indifference curve, which also implies that aggregate economic welfare has increased. Okay. So again, the whole point of this is just to show an increase in the terms of trade is equivalent to an increase in aggregate economic welfare.
How do you know that point D is the left of your condition?
How do I know that? So, it depends upon the shape of the CIC curve. But for normal goods, that's what will happen. So for normal goods, remember, if the relative price of cloth goes up, if the price of cloth goes up, what do you do? A normal downward sloping demand curve, the quantity demanded of cloth falls. So whether it's relative prices or absolute prices doesn't matter for normal goods. Now, it doesn't change by very much because the income effect and the substitution effect are working in opposite directions. Okay, so let's think about the same situation, but now let's think about England here. Now remember, what we've done is we've increased the relative price of cloth. Right? That was our starting point here. But an increase in the relative price of cloth, we have to... so what do we have for England? Just to summarize real quickly. We've got a production possibilities frontier that is biased in the direction of wine, suggesting that England has comparative advantage in wine. At our original world price, relative price for cloth, England will be producing at point A. So we'll have output of S sub W, wine, and output of S sub C, cloth, in England. So that generates our free trade, our initial free trade production point. We can consume our income. We can also consume along this ISO value budget line. So with our income set at point A, we decide to consume at some level given where the budget line is tangent to its highest country indifference curve, which is point B, where we have consumption of cloth out at D sub C and consumption of wine at D sub W. We're consuming more cloth than we're producing, so that gives us our imports. We're producing more wine than we're consuming domestically, so that gives us our exports. So now we see that the relative price of cloth has gone up, which of course implies that the relative price of wine has gone down. Okay. So remember, England's terms of trade are the price of what it initially exports, which is wine, divided by the price of what it initially imports, or cloth. So this implies then that England's terms of trade have also declined. Okay. So how do we show that on here? What becomes flatter? The ISO value line. Flatter? Steeper? Remember, the ISO value line slope is the relative price of cloth. So this is something that when we think about these production possibilities frontier in terms of trade, it's important to remember that the terms of trade are not always identical to the slope of the ISO value budget line. It was for Portugal, and it will be for whatever it should be, for whatever country has comparative advantage in the product on our horizontal axis. So we need to be a little careful there. So here, just like we saw for Portugal, the ISO value budget line is going to rotate to be steeper. And of course, this should have exactly the same slope as the new ISO value budget line in the previous diagram, although I'm pretty sure it doesn't.